So I have become interested in a number of issues in Ukraine having to do with how security is provided to the people of Ukraine in the context of the political transition that took place after 2014, which of course was also accompanied by the onset of the, at that point, initially localized to Donbass and Crimea conflict with Russia, which has now been broadened by the full-scale Russian invasion that began earlier this year. So maybe just to give you a little bit of background, I spent most of my career in post-Soviet research. Early on, as a doctoral student, I was working on issues of migration policy and enforcement in Russia. So I did my doctoral research in Russia. And then after that, I became interested in some related questions about the organization of the police and how it had evolved in post-Soviet countries. And I've done research in Russia, Georgia, Armenia, and most recently Ukraine. And the research that I'm sharing with you today is part of a long-term project, a 5-year project that is funded by the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which is an institution that funds social science research. And on the project, I have 2 colleagues who are professors in Canada, Anne-Marie Singh at Toronto Metropolitan University and Aaron Ehrlich at McGill University. And we're also working closely with a Ukrainian colleague who is a graduate of this institution, whom some of you know personally, Serhiy Bakhlai, who is our Ukrainian coordinator. So over the years, I have started to think more about not just how institutions like the police or migration service operate, but also how security, right, as a experience of an aspect of life is developed or projected or provided through interactions between citizens and the state, and not just by people who are professional employees of the state, as well as by members of the public who are employed in private industry. So my background is political science, but in recent years I have been employed as a criminology professor of criminology, which is a discipline that is still not very well represented in Ukraine, but is specialized on the study of crime and criminal justice institutions, which is what makes it distinct among the social sciences. So part of the focus of criminology as a field is the systematic study of the police and of what we in English call policing, which is a different way of, a difficult term to translate into Ukrainian or Russian, because it encompasses all the ways that rules are maintained or public order is preserved or developed, including by the police, but not only by them, but also including other public institutions, as well as individual citizens and the private sector. So some years ago, when the invasion of Donbass and Crimea first took place, and Ukraine went through a period of political turmoil that resulted in the establishment of democratic institutions, I was very struck by the fact that it's been quite remarkable, both then and now, how in some respects resilient Ukrainian society has been. I don't think you need me to tell you that. People all over the world have commented on that. But in particular, by the fact that following the sort of initial revolution that brought down the Yanukovych regime and resulted in the democratization of Ukraine, there hasn't really been sort of a large-scale breakdown of public order in Ukrainian society, including, now in the current moment of a war against a genocidal opponent that's seeking to destroy Ukraine. So I think there's something about this experience that caught my attention. And what it seems to suggest is that that the ability of Ukrainian society to maintain public order is probably greater than people, including both scholars as well as maybe other kinds of observers, have fully acknowledged. At the same time, there's no doubt that all these transitions or transformations in Ukraine have also generated demands for a different kind of government. So Ukraine, as you all know, has been undergoing a process of decentralization and administration that's resulted in the creation of new local government institutions for the first time in its history, which actually should probably be acknowledged as a major sort of feature of the reforms that have taken place in this country since 2014 that probably should get more attention in the West. And in a way, what we're studying on this grant is kind of the security counterpart of that. So to what extent has the security system of Ukraine become decentralized, and to what extent has it remained highly centralized, and why? So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus a bit, or just briefly run through some of the issues that we're interested in the context of the pre-war or pre-2022 development of Ukrainian public institutions. And then I'll transition into the research I was just mentioning in Estonia and the Baltics. So in this part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the question of sort of to what extent Ukraine has seen and how and why the growth of a kind of bottom-up or localized provision of public security. So Ukraine is, as you know, essentially a centralized state in which some degree of decentralization is taking place. And the question is the extent to which the police will also become responsive to or governed by local government institutions. So we have been trying to analyze the trends in the local police, their distribution, the tasks, and ultimately sort of what's going on, what are the causes of this process. Okay, so I think maybe I will skip this slide since I believe I've covered it. So why are we interested in this? Well, there is a significant social science literature, mainly in political science, but also in sociology, examining how the Soviet Union was governed or how it administered security. I've often thought that the Soviet Union was a very curious kind of state in many respects, one of which was that although it was relatively poor, so at least compared to its primary opponents in NATO, right, it was clearly less economically developed. But if we were to compare it to other developing countries or other countries in the global south, as was done a bit in the past, so in the 1970s and 80s, there was some sort of attention to the relative poverty of the USSR. I think one dimension of that has not been fully analyzed is that the Soviet Union was a state that invested very substantially in security. So it created a huge national police force through the Ministry of Interior, the Ministerstvo vnitřních děl in Russian, that was present in the whole USSR, that employed an enormous number of people, that was very well funded. This institution was often neglected by Western scholars of the Soviet Union like me, although I suppose the generation before me, who were much more focused on, say, the military or the KGB as the instruments of Soviet authority. But in a way, if you think about it, the police and the MIA were much more the place where most Soviet citizens interacted with or experienced the kind of coercive potential of the state. So Ukraine, in some ways, is a kind of ideal place to investigate the legacy of the Soviet centralized police state model in a modern post-Soviet society that's undergoing all kinds of transitions, both political and economic, as well as the stress of the conflict with Russia. So I don't want to overemphasize the degree of centralization or professionalization of security in the Soviet Union. So you're all much younger than me, but you may have heard of different institutions in the USSR that involves citizens in disciplining other citizens. So I don't know, let me just do a little sort of survey. Who here is familiar with the concept of the Upravdom? You are, okay. Oh, most people are, okay. So I guess probably something you heard about from your parents, right? Because it's not really a contemporary Ukrainian thing. Well, okay, so in my earlier research, I was very interested in this sort of the idea that you would have somebody living in your building, right, whose role is also to do maintenance and things like that, but includes a kind of surveillance function. The Soviet Union also had a number of institutions, including party discipline. So members of the Communist Party were subject to internal disciplinary proceedings if they engaged in various kinds of misconduct. as well as the so-called comrade courts that operated in workplaces and other localized settings. So these were separate from the criminal justice system, and they were all involved in kind of controlling the behavior of Soviet citizens. And some contemporary scholars, so for example, my French colleague, Professor Gilles Fabrel-Garrigue, have been very interested in the phenomenon of vigilantism in contemporary Russia and indeed along with some of his colleagues here in Ukraine. So vigilantism is a kind of controversial word, but it has to do with citizens essentially taking on the role of the state to provide security. So either without the police or against the wishes of the police, depending on the context, engaging in the kinds of functions such as arresting people or controlling their behavior that you would expect in a modern European state would be carried out by official institutions. Okay, so I think all of this is to say that the Soviet legacy is sort of mixed, right? On the one hand, it was a highly centralized police state with a very significant policing presence in people's daily lives. On the other hand, it also displayed some elements of decentralization, and it did involve citizens outside the police in the kinds of roles of disciplining, supervision, surveillance, and to some extent punishment that we associate with the criminal justice system. So, I'd like to see how my colleagues and I would like to see how that has played out in contemporary Ukraine, both as a matter of kind of understanding the weight of the past, right, or the extent to which it's possible to move away from this sort of Soviet inheritance. And also, if we can, to maybe provide a useful function for Ukrainian citizens like you who are thinking about the kind of institutions that you'd like your country to have. So I think much of this is going to be familiar for this audience, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. The policing model that your country has is, of course, essentially a kind of descendant of the Soviet model of a centrally controlled Ministry of Internal Affairs, which in turn can be traced back to ultimately sort of patterns of institutional development that we can see in other major European countries such as Germany and France, so particularly the sort of Napoleonic model of a strong ministry, internal affairs ministry. Of course, Ukraine has already moved away from that to some extent by creating a separate national police that is within the ministry, but is autonomous from it, or at least is not directly within the same command structure. So there are all kinds of ways in which the Ukrainian police already interacts with citizens in a more informal way, or is involved in bringing them into the work of the police. So, of course, one that you're all familiar with is the creation of the new patrol police system after 2014, which was a major departure for Ukraine. That was an attempt to create a more community-oriented, accessible, approachable police force. At the same time, we shouldn't lose track of other developments or other continuities, including the so-called, I think the Ukrainian word is dilnichi, and the Russian would be uchastkovi, which is sort of the traditional local face of the police in the Soviet model and continuing to today, as well as the integration into the MIA and the National Guard of some of the battalions that were formed in the 2014 emergency. Okay, so I think I'm going to skip these other institutions, which of course you know about, the National Guard, the SBU. So for me, in some ways, the most interesting aspect of this whole process has been the question about whether Ukrainian localities should be able to provide policing services on their own. So we now have, of course, you're well aware, these so-called hromadas, right, which are a new form of municipal government in Ukraine that is meant to be directly accountable to the citizens and to allow localities to identify their own sort of priorities for their development. The interesting point is that although we have seen a kind of some decentralization in Ukraine, the French model I refer to on the slide refers to the fact that decentralization in Ukraine has mainly involved municipalities rather than regions, right? So just as in France, cities now have more power than they did in the past. That's also true in Ukraine, but it has not become a kind of a federal system like the United States or Canada, where there's an intermediate level of government, the provincial or state level. Okay, so the decentralization process clearly has involved both fiscal aspects as well as a kind of attempt to, for example, through the patrol police system and the creation of community police officers, to make the policing service of the Ukrainian National Police more open to citizens, less intimidating, and less formalistic. Nonetheless, at least until this year, the government has continued to oppose more systematic efforts to try to allow the police to be part of this decentralization process. So that is part of what we're interested in this project. Why is it not advancing? I'm sorry. Oh, okay, great. No, wait. Let me go back. Okay, so I'll spend a few minutes talking about the so-called municipal police or municipal Navarta. So as you might know, in the part of the world where I live, the United States and Canada, most citizens receive daily policing services from police officers who work for their local governments. So Canada has a bit more complicated picture because it also has a large federal and provincial police force in 2 provinces that do provide some local policing services. I could speak about that in the question and answer if you wish, but nonetheless, the fact remains that in North America, which is where I was trained, the basic model of policing is highly localized. And so I was very struck by the fact that what we see in Ukraine now is an attempt by the many Ukrainian localities to, I wonder if I can maybe move this so it's not, how's that?
Yes,
Perhaps we can
yes.
minimize that. So
Yes.
yeah, that's great. So what we're now seeing in Ukraine has been a kind of desire by many local governments to actually be involved in providing policing services to their citizens in a way that is completely new in the post-Soviet region. I think there is no other country, well, let me say outside the Baltics, where I think there has been some more movement in this direction, that has actually attempted to do this. So, as in many other ways, Ukraine is a pioneer in the former USSR in terms of democratizing its institutions. So this has been discussed for many years in Ukraine, including as recently as 2018. And yet, nonetheless, there is currently no actual law that authorizes local governments to provide policing services. So in legal theory, there is only one institution in Ukraine that can be called a police force, which is the National Police, and they have all the powers that go with that of arresting citizens, making them do things they don't want to do, using force against them, if necessary, in certain situations, killing them, and bringing them before judges to be charged with crimes, investigating crimes, all of that. And the question is, I suppose the question for Ukrainians is how feasible is that in a modern society like Ukraine that is undergoing processes of social change, democratization, and decentralization. So the first so-called municipal guard that I know of was created in 2002 in the city of Lviv in Western Ukraine, which may not be a coincidence. So Lviv, of course, is quite close to the Polish border, and I have not been able to determine this exactly, but it may have been influenced by developments in Poland where there is a similar policing structure called the Straż Miasta. So its municipal guard or municipal Navarta was developed to implement essentially systems for controlling parking and building maintenance, particularly in the historic city center of Lviv. So if you've been to Lviv, you know that it's a beautiful historic city. depends heavily on the tourist trade for its economy. And the city government decided that they wanted to have some municipal officers who had authority to, for example, ensure that parking was not abused, to ensure that the streets were kept clear for traffic, to ensure that buildings were properly maintained and were not covered with garbage. So what we can see in recent years, or roughly the last decade, is a kind of rapid growth in around Ukraine of so-called municipal guards. And I think it can be analyzed in different ways. It can be seen as potentially a kind of aspect of the weakness of the central government, that it's incapable of preventing this extra legal form of security from emerging. I also think, though, that you can also analyze it or think about it as, in some respects, a kind of form of democratic vitality. So Ukraine, I've come here for a number of years, and after visiting other countries in this region, I mean, it's really remarkable the extent to which citizens of Ukraine are quite self-confident about their ability to express their views and mobilize politically to demand changes in public policy or institutions. And if you think about it in this perspective, then the desire of people in Ukrainian cities and towns to have some kind of control over their local public security could be seen as a kind of extension of the democratization of Ukraine as a state and the spread of democratic ideas among Ukrainian citizens. So the municipal guards are a very interesting and confusing institution, because they're not really, I suppose I should say, they're actually, some number, right? Many cities in Ukraine, and nearly all large cities in Ukraine now have some kind of localized policing authority. They go by different names. They're sort of colloquially or generically referred to as municipal guards. There's also quite a wide range in the numbers. So, for example, Lviv has a fairly large squad of municipal guards. Another Western Ukrainian city, Ternopil, has a much smaller force. So if you do this, right, per capita, multiply that by 3.5, that would be, it's probably about a fifth the size of Lviv's municipal guard. So how are they sort of legally structured? Well, they're not technically police officers, right? So many of them are incorporated as so-called коммунальные предприятия, essentially municipal enterprises. They operate sometimes in an agreement with local national police detachments, or they can be given a number of other terms, such as so-called inspekcji, right? And among other things, this means that they are not authorized to carry lethal weapons. So that already distinguishes them from Ukrainian national police, right? They cannot carry guns, or they're not meant to be performing the sort of function of protecting citizens' lives, right, in the way that police have the function. So what do they do? Well, this is an example of a Ternopil municipal document that outlines the activities that their municipal guards were involved in, and in 2017. And a lot of the things that they do seem to involve what is often referred to in criminology as the phenomenon of incivilities. So, okay, so in English, does anyone know what civility means? The English word civility? Yeah, sorry, in the back.
I guess something connected to being civilized.
Yeah, being civilized, like being polite, right?
Being
Like,
more,
yeah.
it's a little bit like graphic.
So it's almost like the word politeness. So like a civil answer is an answer that's basically polite, civilized, socially acceptable. So incivility is the opposite of that. But in criminology, incivility refers to things that people do that disturb others in their environment, right? So if you are failing to take out the trash in front of your building, if you are playing loud music or making other kinds of loud noise that bother your neighbors, if you are not maintaining your property so that it becomes an eyesore, is unattractive, or is dangerous, if you don't cut the plants in front of your house, right? All these things that bother other people. So it's interesting that in at least in Lviv, I actually don't have the different articles in front of them, but you can see here. So правила благоустрою, right? Захарашения тротуаров, проїзних частин дороги, відсутність погоджень режиму роботи, right? So even things like fire safety. So somebody has to, actually, sorry for my terrible Ukrainian, right? It's very embarrassing. Somebody has to ensure that these rules are followed, right? And in theory, the national police could do that, but based on our research, they often don't want to, right? So they would say, well, you know, the city could go to their local national police unit and say, well, we'd like you to spend more time working on, I don't know, people who are not following fire safety or not doing this, not maintaining their buildings. But ultimately, they cannot control them, right? Those police officers report to their command structure. And so one thing that Ukrainian cities have been using these municipal guards for is to kind of have more control over their environment to make sure that it's an attractive place for local citizens. Of course, it's more complicated than that. So some years ago in the city of Dnipro, there was an incident in which the mayor, has anyone heard of this incident? So basically the then mayor of Dnipro, I can't remember whether he's still the mayor, basically ordered all these kiosks in public places to be demolished. So like people have these little businesses like selling newspapers or tobacco or whatever, and like the mayor just ordered them all to be demolished. It's not entirely clear that he had the legal right to do that, and he did not use the police to carry out that demolition. He actually used the National Guard. And, you know, as an aside, after that, it was alleged that the people who then took over those businesses or used those spaces were politically connected to the mayor. Okay, so, you know, this seems much less appealing, right? This is a kind of local army that's being abused by position and power. So I interviewed the then member of parliament, Mustafa Nayyem, about the situation. And you know, Mustafa Nayyem is a person who has thought a lot about Ukraine's future as a democracy. And I was quite interested that he said that, you know, right now, we cannot afford a kind of decentralization of policing because this, you know, this is the result, right? That you empower unscrupulous local actors with money or political influence to kind of, to sort of substitute their authority for that of the publicly authorized and legitimate institutions of Ukraine, and in a way that just allows them to abuse their power and to essentially constitute kind of local armies. So the city of Kiev is in some ways a very, also a kind of a complicated, has a complicated arrangement, and it is remarkable how many different institutions are operating in Kiev that have some kind of claim to be security, right? So of course you have the police. You also have the policja ochrona, right, which is the institution within the police that is available for various kinds of work for pay. You also have this institution called the Municipalna Ochrona, which is a sort of municipal guard type force, which is heavily staffed by the veterans of the Donbass War, which was interesting for me as an American originally. So in the United States, a lot of police officers are now veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, and one can imagine that there's a similar kind of tendency here in Ukraine for veterans of your war with Russia to be employed in the police. I won't say that much about it. So it's also been alleged that in some of the local municipal guard units have been involved in or failed to prevent the certain incidents, such as the 2018 attack on a Roma encampment, and that some of the people who work for this institution may be connected to far-right groups. Okay, so you know, clearly these are only three cases out of many, right? And the complexity of this phenomenon is part of what makes it so interesting, as well as hard to study. I'd just like to focus for a minute on what we make of the trend as a whole. So why is there this process of decentralization? And we've developed a number of explanations that we think may have some validity. One is that as an aspect of regional government in Ukraine, or the decentralization of government in Ukraine, municipalities are now, for the first time in Ukrainian history, permitted to collect fees and fines from citizens and keep those funds for themselves, right? So in the past, if a city government sort of collected any kind of fine for a violation of Ukrainian law, that fine, that money became the property of the government of Ukraine. Now these localities can actually collect this money, and just as in the United States and Canada, that creates an incentive for them to actually have their own officers. So, for example, parking, right? So parking in Kiev is terrible. People park on the sidewalk, they double park. It's, completely barbaric. I just heard that the city has now engaged in a lawsuit as to whether it can actually fine people for parking violations. I hope they win. In the US and Canada, this is sort of a very basic aspect of municipal government, and you need somebody who works for you to collect those fines, and you have an incentive to employ people like that when you can actually keep the money. So, all right, as a small aside, I don't know whether this will help illustrate this. So I did my graduate studies in the United States in the city of New Haven, Connecticut, which is a fairly poor city with a lot of problems and doesn't have a lot of money. And New Haven is famous for the most brutal parking enforcement of any city I've ever been in. Like, if you parked your car like 2 minutes someplace where it wasn't supposed to be, you would come back and you'd find like a $300 fine, right? So why is that? Well, it's because this is a way the city could collect money from people. So one explanation of what's happening in Ukraine is that municipalities now have a kind of financial incentive. I think there are more interesting issues at stake, though. So one question is whether these municipal guards are replacing something that the state is no longer doing, right? This is what I meant by this phrase here, up here, neoliberal state retrenchment. So one theory within criminology is that we tend to see more kind of privatized security or local policing when the state stops doing things that it used to do for citizens and basically makes them provide this service themselves. The opposite interpretation is that it's not the state no longer doing something, it's more that there is a kind of process of formalization, right, in which things that before were not fully controlled are now being governed in new ways that may not involve the state directly. So, I think a number of things have happened in Ukraine since the Soviet policing model was operating in the 1980s that make it difficult to answer this question. So one obvious point is that there is now much more private property in Ukraine, right? So people own their apartments, they own houses, they own buildings, and that creates a kind of a need to police or govern these property relationships, or to manage how property is is used in ways that are different from the Soviet Union, and that the sort of centralized policing model that Ukraine has is not really well adapted to addressing. It's also possible that there is simply, as I maybe suggested earlier, been a kind of process of cultural change going on in Ukraine, that you are all a younger generation than me, and you've grown up in a very different society from your parents or grandparents, and that perhaps people in Ukraine today simply expect, for a variety of reasons, that they should be able to control their environment, including the security aspects of their environment, more than people in the past. Clearly, in some cases, there is another element, which is sort of the deliberate abuse of this kind of power by local oligarchs. A final dimension, which I alluded to earlier, is that Ukraine has a large supply of veterans, and these people need something to do. They need to be employed. They are good at they have certain kinds of skills that involve operating in dangerous environments or working as a team, handling weapons. So it's also likely that at least some component of the rise of these institutions has to do with human resources that are available to staff them. An interesting question is what the national police think about all this, and I think it's fair to say that they're ambivalent. So on the one hand, at the local level, they clearly do not want to be ousted, or even at the level of course, at the level of, say, the minister, right? So neither the previous minister nor your current interior minister has been very enthusiastic about the formalization of local policing authority, possibly for the reason that Mustafa Nayyem outlined, right, that maybe they think it's dangerous in contemporary Ukraine. But interestingly, not all police officers are necessarily negative about the existence of localized policing. Some police officers we've interviewed have said, well, actually, it's not that bad for us because they can focus on different things than we focus on, and it can create a kind of division of labor that may be beneficial for us as an institution as well. I think, going forward, and I'm aware as I'm giving you this information that it's all a bit out of date, right? This is obviously was drawn up before the February invasion was launched. I think, there is a series of questions for Ukrainian citizens to think about in relation to the decentralization of policing authority. One is that it is on its face rather hard to think about having a modern democratic society where there is no local government, right? I think people in different parts of Ukraine wish to govern themselves as local communities and don't want to have every sort of policy made for them centrally. And clearly, policing and public order have to be part of that. So there is, I think, a question as to what extent a policing system in a country like Ukraine with 40 million people, the largest country in Europe, a lot of very large, self-confident cities. I spent some time in Ukraine, and it's interesting for me that, if you go to places like Kharkiv or Lviv, they're quite self-confident. So you don't have this kind of like, I don't know, having me to say France, for example, sort of dominance of Paris and French life, I think is not really matched in Ukraine. So you can sort of see that these cities don't regard themselves as inferior to Kiev, and they expect to govern themselves. At the same time, I think it is clear that there are some certain risks associated with the decentralization of policing authority, and the situation that took place in Dnipro is one example. The allegations about the role of the local municipal guard here in Kiev and rights abuses connected to the Roma population. These are sort of clear dangers that would need to be factored into any sort of comprehensive legal plan for decentralization. And it's also not clear that decentralization will be the solution to all the problems of public authority in Ukraine. So the underfinancing of policing institutions, certain aspects of how they're regulated or governed. I see also a certain kind of parallel, and maybe, I guess this is the last slide for this part, and then I'll move on to my next component. I also see a certain kind of parallel here with the debates that have been taking place in Ukrainian society about whether citizens should be permitted to own firearms, right? So again, the Soviet Union had very strict laws on this. Essentially, citizens were not permitted to own guns, with the exception of hunting guns. And even then, you had to belong to a kind of a club, and it was very closely regulated. It's interesting for us as researchers, and we hope to complete an article about this, to observe that in contemporary Ukraine, there has been kind of a debate about whether this policy should be changed. Some other post-Soviet states, such as Georgia and Estonia and perhaps Moldova, have actually moved much further in that direction. So I was just in Estonia, as I said, and citizens there may possess handguns. So pistols and revolvers can be kept at home. In some cases, taken to public places. Of course, obviously, the current situation of the war is only sharpening all these questions, right, about the extent to which it is desirable or even possible for the central government to meet all the security needs of Ukrainian citizens, whether Ukrainian citizens are prepared to accept a status quo in which sort of Napoleonic or Soviet model of a central ministry controlling all aspects of security in their lives is feasible anymore. My impression, as I guess this presentation will have suggested, is that some level of decentralization is probably inevitable, and it's probably most constructive to think about what kind of decentralized model you want, rather than to sort of insist fully on the pre-war status quo. So I was going to maybe close this presentation by sharing with you some research I've been doing with my colleagues in Estonia that is connected to the issues in this slideshow. So in addition to these questions about policing decentralization and private security, we've also become interested in the phenomenon of volunteering in security institutions. And Estonia is a very interesting place to study that because it has much more than most other societies that I know of made a kind of concerted policy to try to involve citizens in opportunities to promote the security of Estonia in different ways. So for example, there is a opportunity for citizens to volunteer with the police, with the rescue service that provides emergency services. And there's also an organization called the Defense League of Estonia, or the Kaitselit, that has existed for many years, that essentially takes citizen volunteers and allows them to train for a variety of emergency situations. So some of them train to essentially be soldiers in case Estonia is invaded, but it also does all kinds of other things that are quite impressive and surprising. So while we were there, we learned that they are also involved in, for example, trying to identify and catalog locations where Estonians could be evacuated in the event of an invasion, so where refugees could live, so buildings that could be made available, and their volunteers are training to administer such temporary shelters. They've also developed a special civil defense app, kind of like the one that exists here for air raids, right? I was told about that. They've also been trained to do other things, such as to assist the police in the case of a riot, or to assist firefighters in the case of a fire. So I don't want to talk too much, so I'll just maybe go through this quite quickly, and I can answer questions about it if people would like. But the basic idea is that Estonia as a state and as a society has sort of decided that they don't want their security to be sort of fully dependent on professional organizations, and they wish to mobilize their citizens effectively and to allow them to contribute their time and energy and talents to the security of the state. I will say that I've just been in Estonia, and of course, as you can expect, not only are they completely sympathetic to Ukraine. I mean, I think Estonia, as probably you all know, has been sort of Ukraine's best friend in Europe, at least one of them. But they also are very interested in how Ukraine has been resisting Russian invasion, and they have been studying closely sort of how volunteering systems have worked here in Ukraine, as many people have. In particular, this Defense League seems to be related to the Ukrainian institution known as the Terra, which I have to say I had never heard of until the invasion began, but probably some of you had already heard of, but has certainly become much better known thanks to the invasion. The similarity with the Defense League is that it involves citizen volunteers who are given some military training and assigned tasks such as guarding security sites or infrastructure, or in some cases defending positions as a kind of light infantry, although not fully integrated into the military or not performing all the functions of soldiers. I think maybe one difference is that the civil defense function of the Terra Barona may be somewhat less, from what I can tell, than the Defense League, which has, as I said, taken on this sort of very large variety of tasks related to protecting Estonian citizens in the event of an invasion or a natural disaster. Okay, so I think, Estonia is in some ways similar to Ukraine. It came out of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. It had a very similar experiences of occupation and large-scale expulsion and a lot of suffering created by the Soviet government, as well as a strong desire not to be reconquered by Russia now and facing a similar threat. It is true that Estonia is different from Ukraine in some possibly relevant ways. So it's a member of the EU and NATO, so it has those resources to draw on. But it's also much smaller than Ukraine, and I think it seems likely to us that that's one of the reasons why they evolved this model of kind of what's often referred to as total defense. So a kind of defense model that just doesn't rely exclusively on the military to provide for the defense of Estonian citizens, but also sort of tries to think about how all of society can contribute to the security of Estonia. So Ukraine, interestingly for me, despite these differences, like many people, I've been very struck by the way not only that that Ukrainian institutions have proved to be surprisingly durable and effective in the context of the current invasion, but also the way that Ukrainian citizens like you have mobilized themselves to volunteer and support the war effort and the attempt to protect Ukraine from invasion. So I think to end on a kind of, I hope, optimistic note, I think, that both what I was discussing earlier in this presentation and these aspects of wartime Ukraine, demonstrate or at least suggest that this society has some resources within itself to provide for security in unconventional ways that neither Ukraine's friends nor its enemies fully anticipated, and that have contributed to and will contribute to the survival of Ukraine as a free and democratic society. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for your lecture. So now we have time for questions. If someone has a question right now, okay, please.
My name is David. Another question: have you heard of such a practice, which was basically normal policing during administration? It's very frequent in Ukraine. The dialogue police.
Yes.
People, I think they have special training.
Yeah.
In general, moderating the communication and domestic situations.
Yeah, I have heard about that. I think it's a little bit distinct from what we're planning to write about in our project, but it's related in the sense that it involves a kind of an attempt to adapt Ukraine's policing system to the realities of the post-Maidan moment, right? So, Ukraine has experienced two Maidans now, right? So the Orange Revolution and then the Revolution of Dignity, both of which were basically popular uprisings that resulted in the overthrow of an authoritarian regime. And, having investigated this a little bit, it's clear that the government of Ukraine has sort of realized that this is a society that is in a lot of ferment, in which people have become aware of their power to influence the government and have a fairly low tolerance for oppressive policing, right? And, the response of Ukrainians to the massacre on the Maidan demonstrated that it was quite dangerous for any government of Ukraine to engage in brutal policing toward protests. So my interpretation of that phenomenon is that it's a recognition that the policing of protests here has to be quite mild. I believe that model was introduced through the sponsorship of Sweden or some of the other Nordic countries. So it's an interesting example of kind of learning or the diffusion of policing ideas within, across countries. I would add that having been here a number of times for large protests, so actually I think the first time I came to Ukraine, or recently anyway, was it 2017, 2018, the Automaidan on, which to me was incredible, right? These protesters just basically occupied the entire, government quarter of Kiev, right? And, it's incredible how restrained the police were in their response. So, I think if I understand your question correctly, I do see some similarities, right? This is an attempt to kind of adapt this sort of highly bureaucratic and somewhat authoritarian policing model that Ukraine inherited to a more democratic environment. Is that what you were getting at? I'm sorry, maybe I kind of cut you off. Yeah. What do you think about it?
It's really what works. Indeed, it really affects the staff, especially the big demonstrations in the night. We had some concerning political prisoners.
Yeah.
And there was big demonstration because the police in the right was visibly scared of the demonstration.
Yeah.
Yeah, the damage is stuff. Even though they have a big problem with far right groups, which
yeah, that's that's also an aspect of Ukraine's current reality, or at least pre-2022 reality, that that maybe distinguishes it from some other democratic states, right? That the level of force that is used against Ukrainian police officers in political protests, including by these far-right groups, is, I think, quite surprising, right? Or at least until recently was much more extreme than we've seen, say, in Canada. Yeah, thank you for that very thoughtful question. You have some other questions?
Yes, I was just doing many people say asked about what was his role in the reforms, was it bad or good? Because Ukrainian society had some different views on that. So what can you tell me?
Yeah, well, he's clearly a controversial figure in Ukraine, right? I mean, with many detractors, the Avakov Chort phenomenon. As an aside, I found it quite interesting that some of the criticism of Avakov came from the political right? So sort of from more nationalistic segments of Ukrainian society that didn't trust him or saw him as insufficiently, saw him as potentially dangerous to them. I think that maybe I'll just limit my answer to the things that I'm more familiar with. And I would say that clearly on these questions of decentralization, he was a break. So he was strongly opposed to any kind of policing decentralization. I think it's an open question as to why that's the case. It could be kind of what Naim said, right? That perhaps he and others in the government thought that Ukraine is a very fragile state and it cannot sort of cede control of the means of violence to anyone other than duly authorized representatives of the state. Of course, it's also been suggested that he and others like him resisted decentralization and policing in part because of corruption, right? That there were networks of nepotism or protection rackets that would have been disrupted by police decentralization, and that was why he opposed them. So, and perhaps not the best person to sort of analyze his motives, but there's no doubt that he was a strong break on moves to kind of create a more localized model of policing for Ukraine. It'll be interesting to see whether under the new minister that changes, whether now or perhaps more likely in a future post-war Ukraine.
And I would like to ask, what do you think about the general tempo of decentralization? Did it tend to faster in these times or no? And I would like to know if the president and the ruling party has any significant report next year or just goes by itself?
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, I think it's too early to assess the sort of result of the war, right? I have followed somewhat the debate about, in the context of the debate about, say, gun control or the regulation of weapons. It's been quite dramatic. If you look at public opinion surveys, that people in Ukraine have changed their mind about this. The government has also issued these temporary decrees legalizing or essentially decriminalizing possession of weapons, as well as creating a legal basis for citizens to use their guns to defeat the Russian invader. I have a hard time believing that can be fully reversed. We don't know what Ukraine will be like after the war, right? And it would be very foolish for me to pretend that I can imagine that. I'm sure you've thought about it much more than I have and have a much better idea than I do. But it seems to me that the war can only promote this decentralization. Another society that I've studied in this region, Georgia, they went through a period of turmoil. They also had conflicts involving Russia with their Abkhazian, the phenomena of Abkhazian and Ossetian separatism. They had the 2008 war. I would say that they have largely resisted policing decentralization. But Ukraine has also been tested in a way that Georgia hasn't. I mean, Ukraine is facing a much bigger war than Georgia ever faced. I don't want to, maybe that's putting it unfairly. Georgia did face in 2008, a real Russian effort to, oust the government of Georgia, but it was defeated more rapidly, I guess we could say. Interestingly, unlike Ukraine, Georgia did liberalize its gun ownership rules. So I think after the sort of political turmoil of the early 2000s, as I've argued in a paper I completed a few years ago, I think the government of Georgia saw it as just not feasible to completely prohibit citizens from owning guns. So I would imagine, to answer your question, that the current experiences of Ukrainians are going to sort of increase demands for that people have, people or municipalities or regions should be given more authority for security. As to the question about sort of how much it matters which government is in power, that's a really good question. So I began my research in the Poroshenko period. It has not seemed to me until the war began that Zelensky's administration had sort of radically different views on these issues from Poroshenko. And I think in part that I believe, or I have the impression that reflects continuity at sort of higher levels of the ministry. So the people that they are sort of listening to are the same as the people who were in office. What do you think about that? Have you noticed any kind of change?
Kind of great question for me because I'm not part of the at all, so I cannot give a
Okay. All right. All right. My sense is that there hasn't been a huge difference, I guess, so far. Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you. My name is Ilya, and my question is about the reform of the ministries, which was announced a few months ago, which was the transformation of Ministry of Internal Affairs, which will be renamed or transformed by into the Ministry of Civil Security.
Yeah. I don't know that much about it or what is envisioned or how much has actually been done on that. Could you fill me in on that, the progress of that agenda?
But basically it's not exactly clear on the two, but as I understand it's exactly about the Ministry of Internal Affairs, it will be just may not know all about this reform, but it will be renamed.
Yeah.
Renamed.
Yeah, renamed.
Renamed, but no, there will be no new functions to the Ministry of Internal Affairs to the Ministry of Security.
Yeah.
Security.
Well, that's fascinating. The name itself is perhaps symbolic, right? I think the Ministry of Internal Affairs is a very Soviet-sounding name, and I assume that getting rid of that name is a political statement intended to indicate that it's not being thought of in that way anymore, right? So, a name like Ministry of Public Security or Civil Security conveys a different kind of message from Internal Affairs. But I hesitate to comment on development that is, as you said, it seems like it's still very much in process, but thank you for bringing that up. I'll have to follow that closely.
Also, have a signing of the question in the chest.
Oh, okay. I see. Okay, sorry. Let me, oh.
It's from Sir Metью Lait.
Yeah, I mean, I began my career by studying, I was very influenced by the work of Louise Shelley, who was the first Western scholar to really analyze the work of the Soviet police in detail. She does write about the fact that the Soviet police did have all kinds of overtly political functions, right? So they did have a role in terms of like breaking up protests, or, for example, if even things like if people were conducting unauthorized religious services, they would be involved in that. So there's no doubt that the Soviet police did have a sort of politicized function that is distinct from the one that, at least in theory, they should play in a democracy. Nonetheless, I guess I would say that they did nonetheless perform many of the functions of police in Western countries in terms of controlling the day-to-day behavior of citizens in non-political matters. I think I would turn Serhiy's question around. So in recent years, I have become a bit more aware of issues of policing and security in Latin America, which is a region of the world that I happen to have more contact with just because of where I live in the US and Canada, right? And something that's really remarkable is the extent to which Latin American countries, even ones like Mexico that are sort of relatively more developed and richer, have kind of tolerated the sort of non-policing of local life. So, for example, in Mexico today, policing is still highly decentralized. There is a small federal police, but there is also most of the police are state or local. And even when Mexico was an authoritarian regime under a one-party dictatorship, kind of like the Soviet Union, they never really tried to create centralized police force like the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs. And as you might know, Mexico today also faces a huge battle with these drug dealers, essentially, right? So you would think that kind of stress or kind of would stimulate them to re-centralize their police, but they haven't. So, I would say, I think you can say that the police in the Soviet Union were systematically different from those in Western countries in some ways, more concentrated in large cities, but nonetheless, compared to other countries at that level of economic development, I do think it's fair to say the Soviet Union made a huge investment in trying to provide security even at the local level in a way that makes it kind of unusual in the context of countries of that income level, and which, in a way is still kind of a heritage of Soviet rule in Ukraine today, right? In the same way that, like other things the Soviet Union did, such as creating a highly educated population, are also still aspects of Ukrainian life. So Ukraine has a lot of very educated people, still has a pretty decent infrastructure, and it has a kind of model of policing that involves a large centralized police force. These are all kind of Soviet legacies for good or ill. So I guess that's how I would answer Serhiy's question.
Yeah, maybe have some thoughts on the performance of the police force in the war. For example, one of the things that we witnessed as journalists working in a city of Lysychansk, which is in the very east of in the east of Ukraine. At some point, it was besieged, only accessible from one side, a city under total war. Yeah. And the police force, interestingly, sort of the local police department took a very interesting position in the whole thing, but most of the tasks were done with the military, but they had still some law enforcement, and the police was responsible for the evacuation of the just ordinary civilian. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts, maybe some research on how Ukrainian police or how police in general reacts?
I am still trying to follow this remotely. I have heard somewhat similar things. So I've also been interested that in Donetsk Oblast, the police are heavily involved in conducting evacuations as well as in delivering food supplies and other relief to civilians in areas affected by combat. I also know that some police have been mobilized into military service and have operated as special policing units, but essentially carrying out military tasks. What can I say about it that you don't already know? I think it suggests a certain flexibility, right? Perhaps born of necessity, given sort of the emergency situation. But in a way, it may be what I could say, if it's a point that's worth bringing up, is that it does suggest that there is more flexibility in this institution than some of us might have thought before the war, right? It can be used in all these ways that are not what it normally does, and it seems to be willing and able to carry out those tasks, whether it's more sort of a relief role or more overtly I wonder whether that is something that is nonetheless sort of limited by or defined by the current context of all that war with Russia, and whether that's not necessarily sort of a precedent for some kind of post-war reorganization, at least. What do you think? I mean, does it indicate that they might be changed in that way, or is it just sort of an emergency adaptation?
I don't know, for me, it was just very impressive.
Yeah.
They were.
Yeah.
And also what decentralized this whole thing works. Basically, even the social program, the military,
Yeah.
like they were also involved in this, working they all in the district.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether, I mean, what I could have thought is that maybe it's sort of some of those decentralization tendencies and the warm studies components that take that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think you must be right about that. I mean, how can that not be the case? You know, the Teroboron itself has evolved in the context of the war, right? So some units are still defending the cities where they were formed. Others have been sent to Donbass if they're not needed where they're from. I think some Kiev Teroboron are now fighting in Donbass. But yeah, I mean, in general, I mean, the other aspect of that, of course, is just the enormous volunteering effort by Ukrainian citizens that has been coordinated with public authorities, but is, you know, completely bottom up, right? So all of these indicate a certain, I've actually thought a little bit about this, and I mean, it's very half-baked, but I'll just throw this out there and see what people think about it. I have wondered whether all of this, in some sense, reflects a certain kind of comfort in Ukraine with informality in institutions, right? So there is the way things are done, there's the way things are on the books, right? And then there's the way things are done in practice. And of course, I'm not naive. There is a difference between those two things everywhere in the world, right? But I do think that maybe compared to, say, Canada, Ukrainians as a society are very used to adaptation or to responding to kind of rigidities in institutions, right? Or deficiencies in them, and are not intimidated by sort of formal legal requirements, shall we say. So I suppose that, one thought I've had is that this sort of tremendous volunteering effort, as well as kind of the flexibility of public institutions that you just described, may ultimately reflect kind of a positive result of these aspects of informality in Ukrainian society that, maybe it's worth taking a step back to say that, those sort of aspects of informality are often conflated with corruption, right? So public institutions not working the way they're supposed to, or, taking money for things they're not supposed to take, right? And I think, among people who study corruption sort of in the social sciences, there's now recognition that the same kinds of aspects of informality that may, in some circumstances, promote certain kinds of wrongdoing may also have other beneficial effects, in terms of bringing people together in ways that are not kind of officially structured to do things that are in this case, constructive. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting point that you raised. Thanks for that.
So my question is kind of connected to your previous answer. In the public medias, I see more and more posts or articles about, let's say, Ukrainian volunteering phenomenon or Ukrainian self-organization phenomenon.
Yeah.
I want to know what is your opinion on that. Can we say that volunteering and at the same time like self-defense can have kind of the same root in history, or is it just the thing that people don't trust government and they would like to take the things in their own arms and do it themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I actually would like to hear what you think. I think it would be a bit silly for me to. Those seem like both reasonable explanations, right? So it could either be informality, people used to doing things for themselves, or it could be, on the other hand, sort of not trusting institutions and not thinking that they're going to help you. So those could be sort of considered to be alternative hypotheses that could explain that. What is your hunch or your inclination?
So basically, I believe that both needs to impact the
Yeah.
volunteering phenomenon,
This, I would like to say that our country is just moved by activists, and activists and volunteers
Yeah.
are helping us much more than the government does.
Mm.
And on one hand, it is actually really good to have active people.
Yeah.
who would like to take the responsibility for a lot of things that people in the world are afraid of. But on the other hand, it can tell us that we have a lot more problems with government that we see in a daily life. So
Yeah.
yeah, and historically, it's the fact that people were organizing everything themselves. So yeah, it just kind of evolves and evolves.
I think that's something that should, I think that's something that should definitely be studied. And I imagine that people will, if they haven't already, will shortly begin analyzing that in scholarly research. I think it's a great question. I mean, you know, seeing the way Ukraine has responded to the invasion, I have thought a bit about, well, what would happen in Canada where I live now, right? And I honestly, you know, look at people in Toronto and I just have a hard time believing that we would respond that way. I think Canadians are very, I mean, speaking in generalizations, are very used to kind of being taken care of and expecting that the institutions will be there for them. Perhaps, you know, for different reasons, Ukrainians don't have that expectation and therefore are more capable of taking the initiative when they need to. Yeah, I don't know. It's a great point.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking your opinion, because I'm in Lithuanian and I'm also thinking about it from my inner perspective.
Yeah.
Outside.
Well, what else can I add on that? I guess the other part of it, maybe one other part of it that kind of against that a little bit, not completely taking away from your point. You know, I having observed this war from our distance and now coming here and talking to some people and having been in Estonia as well and watching their response to it, like in a certain sense, there's going to be a lag between like the beginning of a giant invasion when your much larger neighbor is attacking you with its huge army and kind of mounting an effective response. So, you know, I can't remember who it was, but it's somebody, a Ukrainian colleague I asked about this very same point, you know, suggested to me that in a certain sense, like the volunteering initiatives early in the war, when the volunteers were distributing things like helmets and bulletproof vests to soldiers. So one argument that's been made, at least, you know, I think it's plausible, it should be confirmed, but it makes sense on its face, is that if you're the Ukrainian government, you have limited resources, like you're asking the West to give you all these weapons, or you have some money that you need to buy things. If you can get, you know, if you have these citizen volunteers who are willing to raise money from civil society or from Friends of Ukraine abroad and can do this, right? If they can sort of supplement what you're doing and they can provide some of these necessities like helmets and bulletproof vests, then it kind of makes sense to permit that division of labor, right? Which is a bit different from just saying like the government's not doing its job. It's actually kind of, you know, more about kind of a structured or possibly even planned or at least, you know, or at least authorized kind of just division of labor among different components of society. So, you know, that might be a partial response to your point, or at least something else to bring in mind. But I'm sure that what you were saying is definitely part of the equation in some way. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the military of Ukraine has grown enormously since February 24th, right? I don't know, by a factor of 3 or 4, I forget. So that's presumably part of the equation. Yeah.
Very good point to do that on your question. What's very interesting is that that's not the case in Russia, right? We don't see the same volunteering and the same bottom-up movements in the society in Russia.
No.
Which, you know, comparing the recent history, this might came from the development that this is either the development since 2014,
Yeah,
or well, maybe 30 years, but over. So it means we have some different development. It is a change, and this thing is changing, and activism can be built in society very fast.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I suppose the other part of it is, I mean, obviously, you know this, right? Like the government of Russia has been systematically destroying any kind of capacity of Russian citizens to organize at all. So any kind of association, even if not explicitly political, is now very hard to actually, very hard for it to operate. So yeah, I mean, their whole political system is oriented sort of atomizing society and fully infiltrating any kind of non-governmental institution. So yes, it makes sense in a way that Russia could not evolve that. And perhaps also, I guess maybe the other part of that is could not imagine that Ukraine could do that, right? Like that the Russians perhaps see Ukraine as the mirror image of Russia and could not anticipate that Ukrainian society could mobilize effectively to resist innovation in ways that they correctly think their own society couldn't do. No. Yeah.
Just to add,
Sure.
but if we will take a look on people who are volunteering
Yeah.
for like Russian soldiers, they're supporting war, we can see that there is definitely a totally other perspective.
Yeah.
And probably other way of helping these Russian soldiers because bringing people by satellite and they are barely finding some helmets, for example. And they are not restricted by the Russian government. They have resources. They can like gather the money from other people who are supporting the war without any problems. And still,
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you're right. But maybe in a way, okay, it's a fair point. I agree. I guess, I mean, what I
I'm
would.
trying to say that Ukraine is much better than Russia.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you know, if you're asking, so like, why aren't Russian citizens mobilizing to support the war effort? I think that's actually a great question because, you know, it's hard to see what's going on in Russia, right? But they don't seem to be doing that. They're kind of, you know, they approve of it from what we can see from public opinion surveys, but they're not being asked to contribute to it that much and they're not mobilizing themselves to do it. So I think it's possibly what I was suggesting in the response to the previous question that the Russian government has sort of squashed every kind of initiative. I do have the impression that now, as the war has not gone the way the Russian government wanted, that they are actually trying to demand more resources. It's okay, I'll get it. Oh, thank you. They are trying to kind of encourage society to contribute more resources. So a friend of mine who is a kind of opponent of the government and lives in a provincial city in Russia that I won't identify to protect him has told me that people in his city are now coming under pressure in workplaces and organizations to make donations to the war effort and are also being pressured to enlist. So, you know, Putin, for various reasons, does not want to declare a state of war and a full mobilization, and he does not want to sort of raise taxes, apparently, to fund the war effort. But so they're, you know, they seem to be sort of trying to use repression to compel people to contribute more resources, human and material. But that's different from Ukraine, right? That's not sort of the government mobilizing citizens or sort of using the enthusiasm of citizens. That's actually almost more an extension of the kind of, you know, vertical velocity that Putin is famous for. So yeah, I think your point is well taken. In that respect.
How people say that in Russia we can find totalitarianism, but I believe this is like more autocracy because in totalitarianism you need people who are just silent.
Yeah.
And who are ignoring everything, but in authoritarianism you need people who are silently supporting, like people who are watching the football match. And can we say that people are not volunteering because their mindset is just set to be silently supporting, even though they want to be?
I think that's, you know, so what is the, I mean, I think maybe if I could rephrase your question, what is the Russian government's preferred sort of attitude by Russian citizens toward this war?
Yeah.
I think that's actually a very interesting question, right? And I think that you're probably right that the attitude they want is to do what is asked of them, not to oppose it, and to be supportive in public when they're called on to do so, right? But you know, there may be some tension between if the goal is to kind of create a demobilized society of people who are passively obedient or don't think politics is their business, you know, it's hard to kind of square that with active support for the war effort. You know, I think there are other ways we could see that too, right? That So I, happen to be from the U.S. originally, and, I lived through the Iraq War, and I forget exactly how many soldiers were killed in the course of that. It may have been 5,000 over, a 10-year commitment. And Russia has now lost, 40,000, close to 50,000 soldiers in 6 months. Like that's, for a modern, developed society, that's a lot of soldiers. And I have been surprised that it hasn't been more destabilizing for Russia and that Putin has not suffered more politically for that. So, I think everybody, like you, I'm sure you all know this, part of the answer appears to be kind of a deliberate strategy of sending soldiers from the periphery, right? So from extremely poor, non-ethnic Russian areas of Siberia or the Caucasus. So, they have a population, what is the politically relevant population of Russia for Putin? It is sort of middle class, upper middle class people in a few major cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and his whole strategy appears to be to not bother those people, right? So their sons and husbands will not be taken for the war effort. They are encouraged to think that the war is going well and they should support it, but they should not be called on to sort of, make a lot of sacrifices. A related aspect of this, I've also thought about, I don't know what you think of this, but the debate the European Union is having about whether to ban Russians from entering as tourists, right? I think like a lot of people, I initially thought that was kind of a minor point. Like I certainly see the argument for it, but I sort of figured like, well, how much difference will it really make? But it's been quite interesting to see that the Russian government is almost hysterical about this, right? It really, really bothers them that the EU might not allow Russian tourists to enter the, to enter the European Union. So you have to ask like, why? Why do they care so much? And I think it's related to this point, right? That would be a kind of a negative thing in the life of, the upper middle class population of these major cities that is politically, engaged, right? And they would then be making a sacrifice. They would then be having to make a sacrifice for the war effort that they don't like and that Putin cannot protect them from. So it would be kind of bringing the war back to them in a way that they're not used to, in a way that contradicts Putin's strategy for this population, which is to kind of keep it not very involved. So, having seen that, like the way that Putin has responded with, the sort of level of fury that he and Medvedev have expressed about Estonia not letting in Russian citizens or the EU potentially not giving tourist visas to Russian citizens, I think it's related to this point that their goal is to keep this population demobilized and not sort of have to deal with sacrifice. Like to ask people to volunteer to make sacrifices involves a certain kind of dialogue with society that they don't want to have to engage in. So you're all political scientists. Perhaps you've read the literature on European state formation, like people like Charles Tilley and other scholars who analyzed like how do European states emerge? Well, they emerge through a process of states making demands on citizens in the form of conscription and taxation, and then citizens in return becoming politically mobilized and making demands for services and ultimately democracy, right? And the Russian government's whole strategy is to not engage in that dialogue. So if you think that Putin would then have to kind of talk to these people and say, you can't go on vacation anymore. People in Europe are saying they don't, like the behavior of our government, and you should accept that as a kind of sacrifice for Russia's war effort in Ukraine. Well, that's not something he wants to have to say, right? Even though you might think like, who cares if like, you're a Russian citizen, you can't go on vacation in Paris. It's not going to end it's not as bad as like, obviously what's happening to people in Ukraine, right? That's not the point. It's just that I think for them, this is very, potentially just destructive for the kind of way they want to wage this war.
I got one more reason to say that.
Yeah.
I have a study to see when if you ask some KGB people, what would they do differently during the USSR, so they would keep it alive.
Yeah.
They would destroy the prohibitions to go to other countries of the USSR, because when you have a boiling pot, you need to the vapor. That's why it's not.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, a lot of people also wondered at the beginning of the war whether there would be some kind of exit restrictions in Russia, and why did hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have left, often sort of middle class professionals or young people like you with degrees. people who didn't like the war or politically, or journalists or people in civil society, I think a lot of them left in part because they were afraid this could happen. And yet, so far it hasn't, right? And I think we have to, who knows what the future will bring, but for now, the government has not prevented people from leaving Russia. And I think, that's related to this same overall picture, right? That they would prefer to allow people who are not happy in Russia to get out, right? To just get out, and then you're no longer our problem. But that, if your model is like, if you don't like it, get out, stay out of politics and we'll leave you alone, you're not going to be asked to make sacrifices to the war, just support it publicly and not do anything to oppose it. Well, then you have the problem that when the war doesn't go very well, you have no way of engaging in any kind of dialogue with people to get them to do things that cost them something, right? Whether it's volunteering to be in the war or contributing to the war in other ways or volunteering their time to support the war effort. So, I think all these things are kind of aspects of the dilemma that the Russian government faces, which obviously I hope they don't resolve. But just analytically, that is their dilemma, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
My name is Alex, and I have two questions lined up here. And,
Sure.
Well, I think the second one is more interesting than the first one, but I'll begin with the boring one.
Okay.
Does federalization of a unitary state mean decentralization in policy now? It's like on the map. Makes it happen.
That's a good question. Inevitable is a very strong word. Let me reframe that question and throw it back at you, right? Like, imagine a society that has federal institutions, but has completely centralized control of security, of public safety, just hypothetically, right? It's hard to imagine that, isn't it? I mean, I think maybe that's an approach to the answer to that question. I don't want to make it seem as though decentralization is decentralization itself is a complex phenomenon that involves many different approaches. So, for example, the decentralization of policing in Germany, which is a federal system that's in a country that's probably more similar to Ukraine, right, than say Canada or the US, is state by state. So Germany has, I believe, 15 federal states, and they have their own police forces. And there is a small federal policing institution, I think, that I forget exactly what it is, sort of maybe national security issues. But basically, decentralization in Germany is state-level policing. In the United States, it's mainly municipal. In Canada, it's a mix of municipal and provincial. But that's all not. It's not the central government, right? So I think there are a number of things in this that it's a question of probability or sort of compatibility, right? Like Ukraine is a country of 40 million. It's quite large. It has a lot of major cities that are quite self-confident. It's decentralizing. It's becoming more. It's democratized as a political system. It just strikes me that the record of the last 8 years since the Euromaidan suggests that there is a strong wish among most Ukrainians for some level of control over how security is administered, and that is sort of, I guess, I think the word inevitable might be appropriate, right? It's how could you not expect this to happen? That doesn't mean that Ukraine has to kind of adopt somebody else's model, right? But it would also be maybe unrealistic to think that you can just preserve like the sort of totally centralized top-down model of that Ukraine inherited from, the Soviet Union or even the early decades of Ukrainian independence, and that can continue to operate without any changes in this changed environment. I don't know. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry, I don't feel like it. Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. I will say that maybe if it's interesting for you, sort of complete decentralization or sort of fracturing of policing has its own drawbacks. So, I live in the province of Ontario, and we've seen a tendency in recent decades for smaller municipal police forces either to be merged into larger units or in some cases for small local governments to simply allow their regions to be, particularly in the country, sort of rural areas, to allow the province to provide policing services. Why is that? Well, it's because this is actually a public service that involves money, it involves material resources, it involves human resources. There is an argument that there are advantages to scale, right? And it's not obvious that, a Ukraine with 10,000 police, Ukraine does not need to have 10,000 separate police institutions to be, a free country, right? But perhaps there is some kind of happy medium where some level of policing power is formally devolved to localities and they can do some things that they need to do on their own. I guess that's the best way I can answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. And the second question is, does decentralization of police exclude, some kind of omnipresence, but on local level? It's like it controls all the aspects of the life of the civilians, but on local level, not like on the whole country level.
Does it preclude a kind of police state, you mean?
Not just state, but we have a region or a city, and it is highly, despite decentralization, for example, it's still is strictly controlled by police, and not controlled, but not spectated, but looked up.
Well, I think I understand your question. So let me try and answer that. And if I'm on the wrong track, you can correct me. I think that sort of if the issue is like police abuses, right? So abuses of citizens' rights by police. I don't think it's clear cut that either total decentralization or decentralization is the remedy. We can see plenty of examples of abuse in highly centralized policing institutions. We can see plenty of examples of abuse by local police, such as in the US or Canada, right? There have been a number of scandals over the years. I'm sure you've heard about them. So I think the question of, actually I didn't really address this in my talk, so I can see why you're bringing us up now. I think the question of oversight, right, or how you supervise the police themselves, or how you inculcate good policing practices that are compatible with human rights and democratic, institutions, is part of this question, or a part of this broader question, but is a little distinct from the question about whether the city of Kiev should be able to have its own municipal guard that does some policing functions. Those certainly, decentralization is not a solution to police abuses. And I think if you think about it, it's not even described that way, right? It's much more about local control, democratic responsiveness, but it does not address the question of, how do you ensure that the police don't beat people up or violate their rights or engage in corruption? Those are all important questions that would have to be addressed a bit separately.
Well, I just meant that it can be not just about abusing power, but about and not controlling, but about spectating all the aspects. It's like, for example, it's cameras. It's about the patrols all over the place, and even spectating after you in your own home, but still not accused.
Yeah,
Directly. So I think, doesn't the centralized police, a state with a decentralized police, can it exist at the same time? The centralized police and this
surveillance society.
Yes, this massive surveillance with minor abuse.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, right? So part of the answer may be that the modern digital age has created opportunities for surveillance that are both highly localized, right? So security cameras in public places, but also involving the aggregation of those data. So even if you have like a policing system that involves local control, you can still have national databases or national governing bodies where where, for example, surveillance footage is kept. So, I mean, I can give you a few examples of that. I don't know if this is relevant, but there are now ways of collecting huge amounts of visual footage about people, and like clearly there is, actually, interestingly, Russia and China are pioneers in this. Did you know this? Like Russia apparently has, a colleague of mine has written about this a lot. Like Russia has really moved very far ahead with facial recognition technology, and they're using it in all kinds of places. So a Russian colleague of mine told me that during COVID, his mother-in-law took the garbage out from her apartment into like the dvor, right, violating the quarantine or whatever, and they nailed her. Like they saw her on the security camera, and she was fined or something. And also during some protests since February 24th, the Russians were able to identify people in the metro, the Moscow metro. Did you hear this? So they have actually really sort of mobilized this technology in really extreme ways. But, in the United States, which is a highly decentralized policing system, like clearly this information has ways of being funneled up or shared with other police services. Another example of that I can bring up, it's not exactly on point, but maybe related, is one of our doctoral students at my university is very interested in this issue that you identified, and in the immigration context. So she has learned that, for example, if, let's say that you apply for a visa to Canada, right? And you're denied for some reason, whatever reason. So you think that's it, like I can't go to Canada this time, whatever. And let's say that you then apply for a visa to Australia. So did you know that Australia and Canada are now sharing this information? So like you basically, like you could apply for a visa to Canada here in Kiev, get denied like at the Kiev embassy, and then like you think that's it? Like what happens in Kiev stays in Kiev? No, like actually, this like information is bouncing around the world. It's being shared with Canada's friends. There's this group of countries called the Five Eyes, right? So the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand. They share all their intelligence data. So I think maybe not quite all of it, but a lot of it. So, if you come to the attention of any of those intelligence services, you can pretty much be sure that they're all going to hear about you. So, I think maybe the question that you're getting at, which I think is a good one, is like, what is the problem to which decentralization is a solution? And I don't think it is a solution to either egregious rights violations or problems of surveillance. It is maybe a solution to problems of policing as a public service, right? So not having a kind of police that you or your local government wants. So I think, if it is needed because you want your police to do something for you, right? The sense in which police are providing a public service and not just agents of possible abuses of citizens' rights. I don't think it is a panacea or a solution to the kinds of problems of, public order and democratic society that you are, correctly concerned about. Yeah, sure.
Okay, almost 7. We have time for question.
Yeah.
What we can do to minimize and prevent crime today?
Oh, well, this is a very simple question. I think if I knew the answer to that, I would, governments would pay me a lot of money to tell them. Could you maybe make that a bit more specific? Well, I just would like to, maybe you could give me some guidance as to like, you mean in the policing context? Let's take this context. It's something I know about. That's fine. Well, okay. So, so if I could go back to this, Estonia, your friendly neighbor in the Baltic, right?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples that maybe will be interesting for you as a Ukrainian citizen. So, the former governor of Odessa Oblast, Saakashvili, right, was the president of Georgia, and he did all these like very shocking like reforms. He threw all these people in the mafia in prison. He fired a lot of police, right? And Georgia became kind of famous for that. So people have written about that. I've even written a little bit about that. Estonia is not known for any of that, but I think it may be, it has also done some things in this area that would be relevant for Ukraine as it's working on its institutions. And, you know, for example, some of the things they did back in the 1990s that I think really contributed to reducing corruption were, you know, they focused on certain agencies that are not the police, but that are quite closely related to organized crime or that are needed to prevent organized crime. So they hired a lot of new people in and fired some people from and improved the resources to the revenue service. So the Podatkova, the Podatkova Sluzhba and the customs service, right? So if you think about it, like customs, right, the border, taxation, these are areas where, you know, crime can flourish and corrupt connections between the public sector and the criminal underworld can be established if they're not operating effectively. So Estonia, it's actually something I like to learn more about, you know, seems to have devoted a lot of attention to improving those institutions. Another thing they did that I actually think is also very relevant for Ukraine is, so here in Ukraine, as in other post-Soviet countries, you have like the policja, right, which is basically a part of the police or the Ministry of Interior that is authorized to provide its services for pay to citizens. So the Estonians said, no, we're not going to have that. Whatever is public should serve the public only. And if something is not public, then it should be handled by the private sector on a voluntary commercial basis. And I find it very interesting that Estonia seems to have, as a result of that, avoided a lot of abuses that we see, you know, even in Ukraine, right, including sort of police officers selling their services privately or selling information, right, or engaged in sort of being used by businesses to harass competitors, like all these things that are associated with police as, you know, when they're not prevented from working for pay, the Estonians have limited. So I guess, you know, one answer to your question would be like to think carefully about these institutions and make them work better, you know, in a way, not even directly attacking corruption, right? But just if they are working better, opportunities for corruption will be limited. And I think maybe that's, you know, one lesson of this research. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So thank you for coming. Thank you.
My pleasure.
For
Yeah.
this good conversation. I think it was real like family circle, you know.
Well, I appreciate your interest. It was, you asked really great questions, and I have enjoyed talking to all of you. Thank you.